She stepped off the train to laughter. The cowboy took off his hat and said, "You deserve better." But what he whispered next would change both their lives forever. 6 months later, she would stand at this same platform with a choice that would shock the entire town. But first, she had to survive the humiliation that was waiting for her. Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1874. The wind swept across the open plains, carrying with it the dry whisper of dust and distance. Denon Hollow was no more than a few wooden buildings hugging the railway line. But today the station platform stirred with life. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Men leaned against fence posts. Voices murmured in anticipation. Everyone had come to see the mail order bride arrive. The afternoon sun slanted low, casting long shadows across the dirt-packed ground. The train let out a final shriek as it hissed to a stop. A rush of steam clouded the steps of the last passenger car. From within emerged Maisie Wynn. She stepped down carefully, one hand gloved in cream-colored fabric, the other gripping a modest leather bag. Her dress was sky blue, simple but dignified, with faded ivory trim along the collar and sleeves. Dust clung to the hem from the long journey, but the bodice remained impeccably pressed. Her posture was steady despite traveling all the way from Missouri. She had come here for a new life, a fresh start, a chance to finally belong somewhere. A soft hush fell over the small crowd as she stood there, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She spotted them quickly. Mrs. Lockhart, a sharp-eyed woman in black lace gloves, flanked by her son Riley and his older sister Miriam. Riley was barely 20, shifting awkwardly in his boots like a boy forced to stand still in church. Mrs. Lockhart advanced like a general surveying a battlefield, her gaze cold and assessing. Maisie smiled gently and took a step forward, offering her hand. "Mrs. Lockhart, I'm Maisie Wynn. Thank you for—" The older woman raised a hand to silence her. Her gaze swept Maisie up and down, lingering on the creases near her eyes, the faint lines around her mouth. Faint but present. "You're older than we expected," Mrs. Lockhart said flatly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. Maisie's smile wavered. "I'm 28, ma'am." It was written plainly in the letter. 28. The words rolled off Mrs. Lockhart's tongue like a curse. "We were told you were youthful. You do not look youthful. You look worn." Maisie's breath caught. "I'm sorry," she asked softly, her voice tightening. Mrs. Lockhart folded her gloved hands in front of her like she was delivering a verdict. "We require a bride who can bear children. Sons. My Riley deserves a young, fertile wife, not a woman past her prime." "I can still—" Maisie started, but Mrs. Lockhart interrupted. "We will not argue. You are not suitable." Maisie looked to Riley, hoping for some sign of protest, some flicker of decency. But he avoided her gaze, staring down at his boots like a coward. Miriam rolled her eyes and turned away, already bored with the whole affair. "Return to your train, Miss Wynn," Mrs. Lockhart said crisply. "This arrangement is over." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Riley hesitated for just a moment, then followed like an obedient dog. Miriam was already halfway to their wagon, and Maisie was left standing on the platform in stunned silence. A whisper passed through the crowd. "She's too old, poor thing. Traveled all that way for nothing." Some of them laughed, not cruelly perhaps, but carelessly, the way people laugh at things that don't concern them. Maisie swallowed hard and looked down at her boots. Dust coated the tips. Her grip tightened on her bag until her knuckles turned white beneath the glove. She didn't cry. Not yet. She wouldn't give them that. In the far corner of the platform, Jed Thorne leaned against a wooden post beside a stack of crates. His weathered hat shadowed his brow, but his eyes had followed every word of the scene. He had come to town to collect a shipment of horse feed and pick up 2 fillies arriving on the afternoon train. A deadly wave of swamp fever had swept through his ranch months earlier, taking most of his herd. He was trying to rebuild. He hadn't expected to see a woman sent away like livestock unfit for sale. Maisie turned and stepped off the platform with careful dignity. Her face was calm, but her chest rose and fell with quiet, controlled breaths. The train hissed behind her, waiting to carry passengers back east. Back to nowhere. Jed watched her walk past him, head held high despite everything. Then he stood upright, brushed the dust from his coat, and followed. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She noticed him when his boots crunched on the gravel beside her. "You don't have to say anything," she said before he could speak, her voice low and steady. "I know what it looked like." Jed held his hat in both hands, his gaze steady and honest. "I wasn't going to apologize on their behalf," he said, his voice rough like dry wood. He paused, then continued. "Just wanted to say, if they don't want you, that's their loss." She stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But that doesn't solve the fact that I have nowhere to go." Jed nodded once, then looked out across the horizon, as if considering something far beyond it. "I've got a place," he said at last. "It's quiet. A few hours' ride west. Just me, a barn, and some half-recovered horses." Maisie tilted her head, studying him carefully. "Are you offering me work?" "No," he said simply. "I'm offering you rest." Her brow furrowed slightly. "I'm not looking for pity, Mr. Thorne," he replied. "Jed Thorne. And I'm not offering pity." "I'm not looking to be saved, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not saving you, Miss Wynne," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "Just offering a roof and some space until you figure out your next step. No strings. No expectations." Maisie looked back toward the train, then toward the town. Neither one called to her. Neither one wanted her. She had traveled over 1,000 miles for a new life, only to be rejected before she even had a chance. What choice did she have? She nodded once. "All right." Jed put his hat back on and gestured toward his horse tied nearby. "Then let's ride before someone decides to give you more advice you don't need." And just like that, without another word, she followed him. Dust kicked up behind them as the train whistled once more, preparing to leave. Maisie Wynne did not look back. She thought she was accepting temporary shelter from a kind stranger. She didn't know she was riding toward the only home she would ever truly choose. But first, she would have to survive the ghosts waiting in that empty house and the silence of a man who had forgotten how to speak his heart. She had been rejected at the train station for being too old, and a mysterious rancher had offered her shelter. What Maisie found at Jed's ranch wasn't what she expected. It was something far more lonely and far more honest. The ride west was quiet. Jed didn't speak much, and Maisie didn't ask questions. The trail was long, winding through sagebrush and cottonwoods, over shallow creeks, and under a stretch of sky so wide it felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. Jed's homestead sat on open land. The house was plain and worn but sturdy, the kind of place built to withstand harsh winters and hard years. Beside it stood a barn, weather-beaten and tired-looking, flanked by 2 long rows of empty stables. The wind moved through those hollow stalls like breath through an old flute, soft and mournful. Maisie dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the ride. She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "Where is everyone?" she asked quietly. Jed led his horse toward the hitching post, his voice low and gravelly. "They're gone. Sold or buried. Swamp fever took most of the herd last spring. The rest were too sick to work. Had to let them go." Maisie followed his gaze to a small paddock where 3 horses moved slowly. 2 were limping. One favored a front leg. And then she saw him. A dark bay gelding standing alone in a small pen at the far end of the barn. He was thin, his left hind leg bowed unnaturally, but he held his head high. One ear twitched at their presence, listening. Jed noticed her eyes settling there. "He's the first horse I ever broke," he said quietly. "Came to me near dead. thought he wouldn't last the winter. Maisie turned to him. Why not sell him? He's of no use now. Jed untied his horse and began leading it toward the barn. Some things earn the right to stay, he said simply, even when they can't earn their keep. The words sat with her as he walked ahead. Inside the house, it smelled of dust and old wood. Maisie stepped into the kitchen where the light was thin through the windows. Cobwebs clung to the corners. The stove was cold. On a high shelf behind some empty jars, she spotted something odd. A glass container half full of strawberry preserves. The label was faded and curled on its side. She could just make out the words written in careful script. Ma's Jam, 1863. Maisie reached up and touched the edge of the jar. The glass was warm from the afternoon sun, but something about it felt soft, like a memory not quite gone. She left her bag near the door and wandered into the next room. A plain parlor with a cracked leather chair and a stack of books no one had read in years. Yet there was care in the way things were kept. Not polished, but not abandoned either. Jed appeared in the doorway. "There's a room at the end of the hall," he said. "No key, but the door sticks when it's cold." She nodded. "Thank you." They didn't speak of what came next. They didn't need to. That night, Maisie lay on a small bed beneath a quilt stitched in faded blues and greens. The wind pushed gently at the windows, and the house creaked with age. She didn't sleep much, but in the morning, when she opened her door, she found a small tin cup sitting neatly on the floorboards. Inside was warm milk, still steaming. No note, no explanation. She glanced down the hall, but the house was silent. Every morning after that, it was there, always warm, always waiting. One afternoon, while scrubbing linens in a metal basin out back, Maisie's hand slipped against the washboard. A harsh scrape opened the skin at her knuckle. She winced, holding it under cold water, biting her lip against the sting. Jed said nothing when he passed by with a bucket of oats. But the next day, beside the tin cup of milk, lay a small wooden scoop. It was smooth and polished, the handle carved with simple, delicate swirls. She turned it over in her hand. He had made it. For her. He never mentioned it. Neither did she. The days moved slowly. Jed worked from dawn until the stars appeared, mending fences, tending horses, oiling tools that hadn't seen care since spring. Maisie cleaned what she could. She reorganized cabinets, boiled water for laundry, swept floors that hadn't been swept in months. She never overstepped, but she never stood idle either. Sometimes they passed each other without a word. Just a glance. Just enough. There was no laughter in that house, no music, but the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. One evening, the porch creaked softly beneath her boots. Maisie sat in the far corner, wrapped in a shawl she had borrowed from the back of a chair. The twilight air was cool, edged with the faint scent of pine and horses. A lantern glowed faintly beside her, its light flickering over the paper in her lap. She wrote slowly, deliberately, each stroke of her pen measured and careful. It was the same letter she had written a dozen times before and never mailed. Jed approached from the side yard, his steps slow and unhurried. He carried a small oil can and a worn piece of cloth, tools for the squeaky hinges on the barn doors. When he saw her, he paused. He didn't speak at first, but after a long moment, his voice low, he asked, "You still write to him?" Maisie looked up, startled not by his question, but by the gentleness in it. She lowered her pen. "I suppose I do," she said softly. "Not that it matters anymore." Jed nodded, neither encouraging nor discouraging, just listening. Maisie folded the letter without sealing it. She looked out at the hills, turning dark against the sky. "His name was Sam," she said quietly. "He volunteered in '61. Said it was his duty. Said it would be quick. We would be married that spring." Jed didn't move, didn't interrupt. "He never came back," she continued. "Never wrote after the second year. I waited 3 more. Then I stopped waiting and started running instead." She let out a breath. "I thought maybe if I went far enough, started fresh somewhere new, I could forget what it felt like to wait for someone who's never coming home." A long silence passed between them. Jed's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then turned away. He said nothing. He simply stepped down from the porch, crossed the yard, and disappeared behind the barn. Maisie stayed seated for a while longer. Her fingers ran along the edge of the letter, smoothing a crease that wouldn't stay flat. Eventually, she rose, folded the paper into her pocket, and went inside. But something tugged at her. Later that night, when the lanterns were out and the house had gone still, she saw him again through the kitchen window. Jed stood behind the barn, shovel in hand, digging beneath the moonlight. No words, no rush, just quiet movement, as if the earth had offered him a space to place something heavy. When he walked away, she waited, counted to 50, then she slipped on her boots and followed. The soil was soft where he had been. Maisie knelt, her fingers trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something like knowing. She dug gently, her hands careful. The wooden box was small and plain, with a latch that opened easily. Inside were letters. Her letters. Not sent, not burned, just kept, unopened. Dozens of them stacked neatly. And on top of them, a folded scrap of paper in a different hand. Jed's. She unfolded it. The words were simple. Don't write anymore. You deserve to live, not wait. JT. Maisie's breath hitched. She sat there a long time under the stars, the box in her lap, her heart somewhere between fury and something softer. She didn't confront him. She didn't speak of it. But when she returned to her room and set the box gently on her trunk, she found something waiting on her bedside table. A small clay teapot, still warm. Beside it, a folded napkin and a single line scribbled in careful script. For the throat that's cried. No name, no apology, no explanation. Just that. Maisie didn't cry. Not then. She poured herself a cup, wrapped both hands around it, and let the steam rise to meet her face. And in that quiet, without words, she understood. Jed Thorne wasn't trying to erase her grief. He was just making room beside it. In that silence, something unnamed began to take root. But the town had eyes and tongues, and one widow had plans. What happened next would force Maisie to choose between safety and something she had stopped believing in, being wanted for herself. Maisie had found peace in Jed's quiet ranch. But the town of Denon Hollow didn't believe in peace for unwed women living under bachelor roofs. The whispers that started the morning after she arrived carried on autumn winds that stripped the cottonwoods bare. In the mercantile, Mrs. Hargrove paused mid-transaction when Maisie entered, her fingers freezing on the flour sack she'd been wrapping. Morning, Maisie offered, but the older woman's lips pressed thin as thread. Behind the counter, Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat and busied himself with ledgers that didn't need his attention. 3 other women near the pickle barrels fell silent, their eyes sliding sideways like nervous horses. Maisie felt their gazes on her back as she selected coffee beans, each one a small judgment weighed and measured. She paid quickly, coins clicking too loud in the sudden quiet, and left without the thread she'd actually come for. At Sunday's service, the chill deepened to frost. Maisie arrived alone. Jed had stayed back to tend the horses, and found the usual pew near the back occupied by the Sanderson family, who'd never sat there before. She moved forward. The next pew held only a hymnal and a woman's shawl, but when Maisie approached, Mrs. Patterson swept both aside and slid to the center, creating a wall of skirts. "Excuse me," Maisie said softly. The woman's face remained forward, carved from winter stone. Heat crept up Maisie's neck as she realized every eye in the chapel had turned. She walked the aisle alone, each step echoing like a confession, until young Claire Morrison, barely 17, with freckles and defiant eyes, scooted over on the front pew and patted the space beside her. "Sit here, Miss Maisie," she said loud enough for the preacher's wife to hear. Maisie sank down, grateful, as whispers rustled through the congregation like wind through dead leaves. After the service, Clara walked with her toward the hitching post where Jed's borrowed mare waited. "Don't mind them," the girl said, linking her arm through Maisie's with the fierce loyalty of youth. They're just jealous because you're living the life they're too scared to choose. Before Maisie could respond, Clara's mother appeared, face pinched with disapproval. "Clara Morrison, you step away this instant." The girl's arm tensed, but didn't release. "Mama, she hasn't done anything wrong." Mrs. Morrison's voice dropped to a hiss. "She's living unwed under a bachelor's roof. That's everything wrong. Now come." Clara's eyes met Maisie's, apologetic and furious, before her mother pulled her away. Maisie watched them go, then heard it, a conversation not meant for her ears but perfectly audible in the crisp October air. Two men by the church steps, one in a cattleman's vest, the other the banker's son. "She's after his railway land. Mark my words," the banker's son said. "Woman that desperate doesn't care about love. She cares about security." The cattleman spat tobacco juice. "Thorne's a fool if he can't see it. Should have married Widow Davenport when he had the chance. At least Millie's respectable." Maisie's hand shook as she untied the mare's reins. She wanted to wheel around and defend herself, to shout that she'd never asked Jed for anything, that she'd been prepared to leave twice already. But her voice had learned long ago that protests only confirm suspicion. She rode back to the ranch with her spine straight and her eyes stinging, refusing to let tears fall where someone might see and add fragile to the list of her inadequacies. When she arrived, Jed was mending fence posts near the pasture, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the cold. He looked up at her approach, and something in her face made him set down the hammer immediately. "What happened?" She dismounted, tying the mare with more force than necessary. "Nothing. Everything. The town has decided I'm a scheming woman after your land." His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his ear. "They said that." She turned away, not wanting him to see how the words had cut. "They said enough." That evening, as purple shadows stretched long across the yard, a polished buggy rolled up the drive. Maisie watched from the kitchen window as a woman in a burgundy traveling suit descended, her movements precise and graceful. Even from a distance, Maisie could see the quality of her clothes, the way her dark hair was arranged in perfect coils beneath a feathered hat. This was a woman who belonged in parlors and social registers, not dusty ranches. Jed emerged from the barn, and his posture changed. Not welcoming, but wary. The woman smiled, extending a gloved hand that he shook briefly before stepping back. Maisie couldn't hear their words, but she saw the woman gesture toward the house, saw Jed shake his head, saw the woman's laugh, light and practiced. After 5 minutes that felt like 50, Jed walked the woman back to her buggy. She handed him something wrapped in cloth before departing, and he stood watching the dust trail long after the buggy disappeared. When he came inside, he was carrying a jar of peach preserves. "Widow Davenport sends her regards," he said, setting it on the table like it might explode. Maisie dried her hands on her apron, studying the perfect wax seal on the jar. "That was kind of her." Jed snorted. "Kind isn't the word I'd use." He pulled out a chair and sat heavily, running both hands through his hair. "She invited us to her party Friday night." "Well, invited you. Said it's time you were properly introduced to Denon Hollow society, that it would help with the talk." The way he said talk made it clear he knew exactly what the town was saying. Maisie touched the jar's cold glass. "Do you want to go?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't name. Frustration, protectiveness, something else beneath. "No, but she's right that it might help. Millie Davenport owns half the businesses in town. If she accepts you, others will follow." Maisie heard what he didn't say, and if she doesn't, the whispers will turn to shouts. "Then we'll go," she said quietly. Jed stood, started to speak, then stopped. His hand lifted as if to touch her shoulder, hovered in the air between them for a heartbeat, then fell. "I'll hitch the wagon Friday evening," was all he said. The days between crawled and raced simultaneously. Maisie took out her sky blue dress, the one she'd worn off the train to her humiliation, and spent 2 evenings mending the hem and letting out seams worn thin with wear. She had no other option. Her brown everyday dress was patched at the elbows, and her Sunday gray was too plain for a party at the Davenport house. Wednesday evening, she sat on the porch with needle and thread, watching Jed work with one of the new horses in the corral. He moved with patient confidence, his voice low and steady as he gentled the skittish mare. She wondered if he'd spoken to his lost fiancée that way, with that same quiet certainty. The thought surprised her with its sharp edge of something uncomfortably close to jealousy. Thursday afternoon brought unexpected warmth, and Maisie hung laundry in the yard, her mind miles away. She didn't hear Jed approach until his shadow fell across the sheets. "You've been quiet," he said. She pinned a pillowcase with more attention than it required. "So have you. We're well matched that way." He was silent long enough that she finally looked at him. His hat was in his hands, turning slowly, and his expression was unreadable. "Maisie, But whatever he meant to say was cut short by the thunder of hooves. The skittish mare had somehow gotten through the gate and was heading toward open range. Jed cursed and ran for his gelding, and the moment dissolved like morning mist. That night, lying in her narrow bed with moonlight painting silver bars across the quilt, Maisie replayed those 2 words. Jed, What had he been about to say? And why did her heart beat faster wondering? Friday arrived with merciless clarity. Maisie spent the afternoon in a state of careful preparation, heating water for a bath, washing her hair with the last of her lavender soap, pressing her dress with irons heated on the stove. When she finally stood before the small mirror in her room, she barely recognized herself. The blue dress, despite its age, still brought out the color of her eyes. She'd pinned her hair in a simple twist, and for just a moment, she could almost pretend she was someone who belonged at social gatherings, someone who hadn't been publicly rejected as too old and worn. The illusion shattered when she walked into the main room and saw Jed's face. He stood by the door in his Sunday suit, collar starched stiff, and when he turned and saw her, something flickered across his features. Not disgust, not disappointment, but something that made her breath catch. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual careful neutrality. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The ride to the Davenport house passed in uncomfortable silence. Jed kept his eyes on the road, his hands tight on the reins. Twice Maisie started to speak, and twice she stopped, the words dying before they formed. What could she say? That she was terrified of facing the town's judgment again? That she'd grown so accustomed to their quiet life that crowds now felt like storms? That somewhere in the past weeks, she'd stopped thinking of his ranch as temporary shelter and started thinking of it as something dangerously close to home? The Davenport house appeared around a bend, a grand 2-story structure with wraparound porches and windows glowing golden in the dusk. Carriages and wagons lined the drive. Laughter and music spilled from the open doors. Maisie's stomach clenched. "We don't have to do this," Jed said quietly. She looked at him, at the stubborn set of his jaw that she'd come to recognize as his version of concern. "Yes, we do." She climbed down before he could help her, straightened her skirts, and walked toward the light. Millie Davenport met them at the door with a smile that was all teeth and calculation. "Jed, Miss Maisie, how wonderful you could come." She was even more striking up close. Dark eyes sharp with intelligence, figure curve in all the places Maisie's had gone angular with age and hardship. This was a woman who'd never been rejected at a train station, never been called too old at 28. This was a woman who belonged. Come in, Millie continued, linking her arm through Jed's with practiced ease. "Everyone's dying to meet your house guest." The pause before house guest was deliberate. A tiny knife slipped between ribs. Maisie followed them into a parlor packed with Denton Hollow's finest. Cattlemen and their wives, the banker, the doctor, the territorial judge. Conversations paused as they entered. Mrs. Hargrove's eyebrows rose. The preacher's wife whispered to her companion. Maisie felt like a specimen under glass, every worn seam and darn patch on display. Millie separated them immediately. Jed, the judge wants to discuss that railway easement on your property. Miss Maisie, let me introduce you to the ladies. She swept Jed away before he could protest, leaving Maisie surrounded by a circle of women whose smiles didn't reach their eyes. For the next hour, Maisie endured questions disguised as concern. How long do you plan to impose on Mr. Thorne's hospitality? Have you family back east you'll be returning to? It must be difficult being so dependent on a bachelor's charity. She answered with quiet dignity, refusing to be baited, but each question left another bruise. Across the room, she caught glimpses of Jed in uncomfortable conversation with the judge and several other men. Millie hovered at his elbow, laughing at his responses, touching his arm. The message was clear. This is where he belongs. With someone like me. Someone appropriate. At 8 o'clock, Maisie excused herself to the porch, needing air that didn't smell of perfume and judgment. The night had turned cold, stars sharp overhead. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the distant mountains, black shapes against darker sky. Not enjoying the party, the voice made her turn. Young Clara stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of punch. Mama dragged me here, but I saw you escape. Thought you might want this. Maisie took the cup gratefully. Thank you. Clara leaned against the porch rail. They're wrong about you, you know. All of them. Maisie smiled sadly. They're protecting their friend. Mrs. Davenport wants Mr. Thorne's land, Clara interrupted. Everyone knows it. Her husband left her comfortable, but that railway easement would make her rich. She's been circling him for 2 years. The information settled cold in Maisie's stomach. Then why doesn't he? Because he's an idiot, Clara said bluntly. All men are when it comes to seeing what's right in front of them. But you're good for him. Everyone can see it, even if they won't admit it. Before Maisie could respond, the door opened and Jed emerged. His face was tight with some emotion she couldn't read. We're leaving. Not can we leave, or are you ready? Just a flat statement. Maisie set down her cup. Now. He was already walking toward the stairs. Now. She followed, Clara calling a soft goodbye behind them. They retrieved the wagon in tense silence, and Jed drove with unusual speed, the horse's hooves pounding hard on the packed earth. Miles passed before Maisie finally said, "What happened?" His knuckles were white on the reins. Millie announced to the judge and half the town that I proposed to her. Maisie's heart stopped. Did you? He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his eyes were fierce. No, I told her a month ago I wasn't interested. Apparently, she decided ignoring my answer was easier than accepting it. He returned his attention to the road. I corrected her, publicly, in front of everyone. The implications crashed over Maisie like cold water. Then the town thinks. The town thinks you're the reason I refused her. That you're some scheming woman who stole me away from respectable Millie Davenport. His laugh was bitter. The judge suggested I do the honorable thing and send you packing. Maisie felt something crack in her chest. Not surprised. She'd known this was coming. But the confirmation still hurt. Then that's what you should do. He pulled the wagon to a sudden stop, so abrupt the horse snorted in protest. What? She forced her voice to stay steady. I won't ruin your name. I brought you nothing but trouble since I arrived. The town blames me for your rejection of Mrs. Davenport, for living in your house unwed, for existing where I don't belong. I should go. She couldn't look at him. I'll leave in the morning. The silence stretched so long she finally had to glance over. Jed sat frozen, his face a battlefield of emotions she couldn't decipher. Then, without a word, he clicked the reins and drove them home. Neither spoke again. When they arrived, Maisie went straight to her room and closed the door that still stuck in its frame. She didn't cry. Tears felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, but she sat on the edge of her bed until the moon set and dawn began to gray the window. In the main room, Jed paced until his legs gave out, then sat at the table with his head in his hands. He'd spent his whole life learning that silence was safer than speaking, that stillness prevented loss. Now his silence had driven away the first person since his fiancée's death who'd made his hollow house feel like something worth protecting. Pride and fear warred in his chest, and neither gave him the words he needed. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Maisie packed methodically, folding each garment with careful precision. Her sky blue dress, her worn brown work dress, her gray Sunday best. The carved wooden scoop Jed had made sat on the washstand, and she touched it once, gently, before leaving it behind. Some things weren't hers to take. She wrote a brief note and left it on her pillow. Thank you for seeing me when no one else would. Thank you for milk and silence and carved wood and kindness. I won't forget. M. She took one last look at the room, the window that faced east toward sunrise, the door that stuck, the quilt his mother had sewn. Then she picked up her valise and walked into the main room. Jed stood by the stove, coffee untouched in his hand. They stared at each other across 10 feet that felt like 10 miles. The stage leaves at 9, Maisie said. He nodded. I'll hitch the wagon. They rode to town in silence heavier than any they'd shared before, because this one was final. At the station, Jed carried her valise to the platform and set it down gently. Around them, Ditton Hollow was waking. Shopkeepers opening shutters, children running to Saturday errands. Normal life continuing while Maisie's fractured again. Maisie, Jed said, and her name in his rough voice made her eyes sting. She turned to him, memorizing his face, the lines around his eyes from squinting at sun, the stubborn jaw, the mouth that smiled so rarely but transformed when it did. Thank you, she said, for everything. He looked like he wanted to say something, his lips parting, his hand rising. Then he just nodded, put his hat back on, and walked away. Maisie watched him go, watched him climb into the wagon, watched him drive out of sight. The stage wouldn't arrive for another hour. She sat on the bench with her valise at her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and tried not to think about warm milk or carved wood or how his eyes had looked in firelight when he almost spoke. 2 days later, she'd see smoke on the horizon and run. But for now, she just sat and waited and tried to believe leaving was the right choice. 2 days after Maisie left, Jed's world was about to burn, and she was about to prove that love isn't about staying when it's easy. It's about coming back when it's impossible. The morning arrived with an ominous stillness, the kind of quiet that makes animals nervous and old-timers check the sky. Jed had spent 2 days moving through his routine like a ghost, milking the cow no one drank after, cooking meals he didn't eat, sleeping in a house that echoed with absence. He told himself it was better this way, safer, that caring for nothing meant losing nothing. Then he smelled smoke. The barn was engulfed before he reached it, flames already climbing the walls like hungry hands. The horses screamed inside, their terror cutting through the roar of fire. Jed didn't think, just ran, throwing open the main doors to a wall of heat and smoke. He got 2 horses out, their eyes rolling white with panic, then turned back for the old gelding, the one who'd survived swamp fever when everything else died. The beam fell as he was leading the horse towards safety, catching him across the shoulders and pinning him against a stall. The gelding bolted past him to freedom. Jed couldn't move, couldn't breathe through the smoke filling his lungs like black water. His vision grayed at the edges. Somewhere in the haze of fading consciousness, a thought surfaced clear and cold. I deserve this. I let her go without fighting, without speaking. The smoke took him under. Miles away, Maisie sat in a stagecoach that had broken an axle on the rutted road to Denver. The driver and other passengers had walked toward town for help, but Maisie stood by the roadside, staring at the horizon. That's when she saw it, a column of smoke rising in the wrong direction, not from town, but from the empty country where Jed's ranch stood alone. Her heart stopped, then slammed against her ribs. She didn't decide to run. Her body just moved, dropping her valise and lifting her skirts as she sprinted across open prairie. Her boots weren't made for running. Her corset wasn't made for breathing, but none of it mattered. The smoke grew thicker as she ran, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, and one thought pounding with every footfall. Not again. I won't lose another man to silence. She arrived to hell made real. The barn a skeleton of flame, horses scattered across the yard, and no sign of Jed. Jed, she screamed, her voice raw. Jed Thorne. Nothing but the roar of fire answered. Then she heard it, faint beneath the crackling, a groan from inside the barn. She didn't hesitate, didn't think about how the roof could collapse any second or how smoke killed faster than flame. She plunged through the door into choking darkness lit by orange death. She found him against the stall, unconscious, a beam across his back. "You stubborn, stupid man," she gasped, shoving at the beam with strength she didn't know she had. It moved inches enough. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him backward, her muscles screaming, her sleeve catching fire. She slapped it out and kept pulling, kept moving as behind them the roof groaned. They cleared the doorway as the structure collapsed inward with a roar like God's judgment. They fell together in the dirt 20 feet from the flames, both gasping, both alive. Jed's eyes opened slowly, unfocused, then found her face. "You came back," he whispered, and it wasn't a question, but a prayer answered. Maisie was crying now, couldn't stop, her hands on his face. "Of course I did, you fool." They lay there in the ash and dirt, hands finding each other and holding tight. "Why?" he asked. She looked at him, this man who'd given her silence when she needed it and kindness when she'd forgotten it existed. "Because halfway to Denver, I realized I was running again. From everything real." His grip tightened on her hand. "You should have kept running. Everyone leaves me." Her voice broke. "Maybe because you never asked them to stay. You just accept loss like you deserve it." His other hand came up to touch her face, trembling. "Stay," he whispered. "Please stay." She leaned her forehead against his. "Always." The fire had burned away everything but truth. But truth, in a town like Denton Hollow, required courage and witnesses. 2 days after the fire, both Maisie and Jed bore its marks, his back wrapped in bandages, her hands blistered from dragging him through flame. She stayed this time without asking permission, sleeping in the chair beside his bed those first nights when fever made him restless. On the third evening, when he could finally sit up without wincing, they talked in the firelight about things they'd both been too afraid to name. Jed told her about the fiancé who died in childbirth along with their baby, how he'd built this ranch as a monument to people who'd never see it. "I thought if I didn't ask for anything, I couldn't lose anything," he said quietly. Maisie understood that language, had spoken it herself for 5 years. "And I thought if I kept moving, I couldn't be left behind." Their hands found each other in the space between chairs, and this time neither let go. A week later, the town came to them. Maisie was hanging laundry when she saw the line of wagons approaching. Millie Davenport's buggy in the lead, the preacher's wagon behind, half a dozen others following like an invasion force. Jed emerged from the house, moving stiffly, and positioned himself between Maisie and the arriving delegation. Millie descended first, her face a mask of concerned propriety. "Jed, we've come as friends. This situation has gone on long enough. The territory has standards, and an unmarried woman living under your roof. Get off my land," Jed interrupted, his voice hard as winter ground. The preacher stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne, we're trying to help. This arrangement must be formalized or ended. If necessary, we'll involve the territorial marshal." Maisie felt the threat like a physical blow. After they left, dust settling in their wake, she made her decision. "I'm leaving," she told Jed. "I won't let them force you into anything." He didn't argue, didn't fight, and his silence cut deeper than any words could. Friday arrived too soon. Maisie stood on the same platform where she'd been rejected 6 months ago, the autumn fair in full swing around her. She wore her mended blue dress and carried her valise and a ticket to anywhere that wasn't here. The crowd noticed her immediately, whispers spreading like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Mrs. Hargrove nudged her companion. The banker's son pointed. Even Millie Davenport, browsing the fair stalls, turned to look. The train whistle sounded in the distance, and Maisie closed her eyes. Some stories didn't have happy endings. Some women just kept moving. Then she heard the wagon, heard the crowd's murmur shift to something else, and opened her eyes to see Jed pushing through the gathering townspeople. He was bandaged, limping, determined, and heading straight for her platform. The fair went silent. Every eye fixed on them as Jed climbed the platform steps and stood before her and everyone. "Most of you were here when she stepped off this train," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet. "You sent her away for being too old at 28, for not being pretty enough for your standards. But she pulled me from a burning barn when she could have kept walking to Denver. She saved my life." He turned to the crowd, and Maisie saw something she'd never seen before. Jed Thorne speaking without hesitation, without silence to hide behind. "She saved me long before that fire, with kindness you all refused to give. And I was too much of a coward to tell her what she meant until she was leaving." He turned back to Maisie, and despite his injuries, despite the watching town, he dropped to one knee on that wooden platform. "I'm not asking you to stay because you have nowhere else. I'm asking because when I think of home, it's your voice I hear. Marry me, not because they demand it, because I choose you. If you'll have a stubborn cowboy who's slow to speak but means every word." Maisie looked at her valise, at the ticket in her hand, at the crowd holding its breath, at this man who'd finally learned to fight for what mattered. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she dropped the ticket and took his hands. "I've been chosen for land, for children, for convenience. But you chose me for me. Yes, Jed Thorne. Always yes." The valise hit the platform with a thud that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. The crowd erupted in applause, and even Millie Davenport clapped slowly, a gracious defeat. The train arrived and left without her, and Maisie didn't look back once. From rejection to rescue, from silence to declaration, Maisie and Jed had chosen each other. Now came the life that choice had built. 3 weeks after the platform proposal, they married under the cottonwood tree beside the rebuilt barn. It was small but meaningful. Maisie's students scattered wildflowers. Clara Morrison cried happily in the front row, and even Millie Davenport stood at the edge with a respectful nod. Maisie wore a borrowed dress hemmed by her own hands, and Jed stood in a pressed shirt that barely fit his shoulders. The old gelding watched from the pasture, a red ribbon tied to his halter. When the preacher asked for vows, Jed spoke clearly, his voice steady. "I promise to speak, even when silence is easier." Maisie's voice didn't waver. "I promise to stay, even when leaving feels safer." The ring he slipped on her finger was forged from horseshoe metal, simple and strong. "Some things earn the right to stay," he whispered as he kissed her, and the small gathering witnessed what rejection had tried to prevent: two people choosing each other completely. Life built itself slowly after that, brick by brick, morning by morning. They rebuilt the barn together, Maisie handing him tools and learning the rhythm of construction. Her teaching expanded. 5 regular students now came 3 days a week, studying at the kitchen table while Jed worked outside. The morning milk ritual continued even after marriage, Jed leaving a warm cup outside her door before dawn, a habit neither wanted to break. He learned to speak his feelings in small ways, a hand on her shoulder when passing. "I'm glad you're here," murmured over evening coffee. She learned to stay through discomfort, to talk through disagreements instead of packing bags in her mind. The old gelding followed them everywhere, a shadow with knowing eyes, as if he understood he'd been part of something larger than himself. The town's full acceptance came gradually. Invitations to Sunday dinners, genuine smiles at the mercantile, Clara's mother finally admitting Maisie had been good for everyone. The ranch thrived with new horses, new life, new purpose. Winter brought snow and something else. Maisie pregnant, her body changing in ways that terrified and awed them both. Jed's tenderness during those months broke something open in her. The way he'd bring her tea without asking, rub her aching feet by the fire, whisper to her belly about the world waiting outside. When labor came, the deepest part of winter, it was fierce and fast. The midwife barely arrived in time to catch the baby girl whose first cry was strong enough to rattle the windows. Jed held his daughter with shaking hands. This man who'd lost everything once and been given everything again. "Lena," Maisie whispered from a bed, exhausted and radiant. "We'll call her Lena." He looked at her with eyes bright with tears. "What you carried and gave back to me." Watching him become a father, present, soft, everything his own father hadn't been. Maisie understood that healing wasn't just surviving. It was choosing to build something new from the ashes of what burned. 1 year after the platform proposal, winter evening settled soft over the ranch. Snow fell in fat flakes outside the window, where Lena slept in her cradle, 6 months old and dreaming whatever babies dream. The old gelding stood on the porch like a guardian, his breath steaming in the cold. Inside, fire crackled in the hearth, and Maisie and Jed sat in rocking chairs that creaked in comfortable rhythm. Her hand rested in his, their fingers intertwined with the ease of daily practice. He stood and brought her warm milk, the cup radiating heat into her palms. She smiled up at him. Still, he smiled back, and it transformed his whole face the way it always did. Always. He settled back into his chair, and they sat in perfect silence, the kind that didn't need words because everything had already been said. Outside, the vast Wyoming sky stretched endless and cold, but inside was warmth and light and the quiet sound of chosen love. This was home, not a place stumbled into by accident or desperation, but one built deliberately, morning by morning, in milk and carved wood and words spoken late, but not too late. She had arrived, not at a destination, but at a choice. And that choice was love, chosen every day in steady hands and quiet hearts. She was home,